What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you all of the upcoming CRPGs. I'm looking forward to the news about them, etc., which is a video I like to make roughly, I would say, twice a year, primarily for the purpose of updating and keeping people informed about all of the CRPGs that are, of course, upcoming, as individually some of them would be very difficult to cover on their own, but in aggregate I can make an entire video about it like this. And we've had, I would say, pretty busy, roughly 6 months since I last talked about this. However, do keep in mind, if you watch my channel super regularly, I would imagine you will have heard me talk about most of these in some capacity outside of one or two of them. But otherwise, let's go ahead and dive right in. So the last roughly 6 months have been very active. We've seen the release of things like Esoteric Ebb, Banquet for Fools, Sector Unknown, etc. And these are, for the most part, indie CRPGs, but it's been a pretty good start to the year for them. But looking ahead, by far and away the biggest announcement or reveal we have seen was at the Game Awards, of course, with the next Divinity title, which has already been confirmed to be another CRPG. Chances are you've heard me talk about this a great deal. I covered it quite a bit, the announcement and everything we know so far, etc., back in December. And while I can't say too much more until we know more about the game itself, for the most part, everything's looking good. They've even hired a team to solidify the lore, which was a bit of a problem with the older titles, which were kind of all over the place. But as a former Divinity lore channel, nobody is more excited about this than me, dare I say. Now, we don't have any dates or anything like that about this, to be clear, but they have expressed interest in doing another early access release and then, iterating upon that like they did with their previous games. And so I would love to see early access by 2027, but there's just simply no way to know that for sure. Moving on, also back in December, we got a look at the alpha for Warhammer 40k Dark Heresy, another CRPG set in the Warhammer 40k universe from Owlcat Games. And so if you've played Rogue Trader from them, you'll get, I would say, more or less how a good chunk of this is going to work. But the really cool thing about the alpha was that it gave us a look at some of the new systems, like their concentration system they have, the changes they've made to what is effectively a morale system for both you and the enemy, how the investigation system is going to work, because Dark Heresy revolves around you being a member of the Inquisition and having to investigate heresy. And it was a very good first look. Now, since that alpha, we haven't heard too much more about Dark Heresy. I am hoping to hear about a beta sometime this year and, ideally a release not too long after that. They usually do a 6-month or so beta. And so if they were to use the Summer Game Fest to announce said beta and then roll forward with that, we could theoretically see this game towards the end of the year, but we have absolutely no idea about that for sure, and we will simply have to wait and see what happens. Next up, Starfinder Afterlight. So this is a CRPG set in the Starfinder universe, a sort of far future look at Pathfinder, which is also using their 2E rule set. But this one very, very recently, just a roughly week or so ago, is opening up its public playtest. You can play roughly the first hour or so of what is effectively a very early alpha build, just kind of showing off some of the mechanics and what they had in mind, so they can collect feedback as they move forward. With that in mind, we still don't have any idea of an actual release date for this either. I think 2027 seems likely just generally, but we don't know that for sure. So if you wanted to check this out for yourself a little bit, you can definitely do that. Otherwise, not too much to say about it right now. And so let's continue. Then we've got Pathfinder, The Dragon's Demand. So this is an upcoming CRPG from Ossian Studios, which is taking the unique approach to throwing out miniatures and stuff for the game. I've been keeping an eye on this. They have been providing updates via Kickstarter, where they kickstarted the game, which I had backed. And they seem to be making pretty steady progress. They gave us an update on the beginning of March, talking about how the game would be handling dice rolls. They've previously discussed movement and the like. But otherwise, really not too much more about this one we didn't already know, but, still looking forward to it. Moving right along, however, I then want to talk about Stellar Tactics. Stellar Tactics is a CRPG that I had not talked much about previously until very recently, because this is a game that has been in early access for an extraordinarily long time, 10 years, but it is finally launching out of early access on March 30th, so you'll be able to see the full version for yourself. And while this is a game that was effectively made by one person, it's doing some fun and interesting stuff in that space. but it does lean on some things like procedural generation and world seeds to make a truly massive universe that I don't think anyone would ever fully be able to explore, something like 160,000 star system, something like that. But it's an interesting setup about fighting some horrible space plague that has evolved and mutated over the years, but given that there's a bunch of different difficulty options and the like to mess around with, it seems like a pretty promising game for a lot of people. And so I think people should be aware of it. Following on from that, I then want to mention Shadow of the Road. This is an upcoming title that I've been keeping an eye on for a little while. Truth be told, I think it might lean a little more into the CRPG side of things, but we do have a confirmed release window of 2026 for this one now, and given all the updates and dev diaries and things they've been posting for quite some time over on places like Steam, it's clear they're getting closer and closer to that date, so that seems roughly accurate. Either way, however, I'm looking forward to some turn-based battles set in a steampunk magitech reimagining of feudal Japan, and we'll see if it manages to deliver on that premise, I suppose. This next title is one I've been talking about for quite some time, as it's been delayed several times, The Way of Wrath. The Way of Wrath is an upcoming CRPG that puts you in the role of a tribe getting ready for an imminent attack. You have a bunch of different potential ways through that, and while I took a look at a demo quite some time ago, they've put out updated stuff since then, so I don't think that's really representative of what the game is at this point. However, while this was initially slated for 2025, it's been updated for 2026, which was no real surprise, but with any luck it will actually release this year, and I can do more than just mention it in these videos, because it's an interesting premise that I hope they manage to deliver on. As the gist of how well the battle goes based on the preparation you manage to do, etc. And we'll see what happens with it at the end of the day. This next title, however, is one I will be mentioning for the very first time, and I believe it's called Avaria, Iron Rule, something like that. And this is actually a follow-up to another CRPG called Black Geyser Couriers of Darkness, with this game being a prequel to that one, set about 25 years prior. And it looks like a pretty big step up in production value for them, but Black Geyser was a very, I would say, rough around the edges CRPG, and it will be interesting to see what they manage to do with this follow-up. But it is quite some time off. I believe they're gearing up to do a Kickstarter for it, and we'll see how that ultimately pans out. But I'll probably wind up supporting them just to see what happens with it, I suppose. Speaking of Kickstarters, however, we then have the Legends of Awen, The Rise of the Fianna. This is a CRPG I took a look at via a demo quite some time ago that is also gearing up for a Kickstarter, though it has been for a while, so I think it's a fair ways off yet. However, it is aiming to be a sort of story-driven narrative experience in a Celtic setting, if you couldn't tell by the names, and the demo I played at the time was promising, but given the pre-Kickstarter state of it and everything, it's hard to say how much it will change between now and whatever their final vision winds up being. But there's some promise there, so I figured I'd go ahead and throw it on here. Following on from that, we then have a Sword Hero. Sword Hero is another title that recently went through a Kickstarter as well, though successfully. That's already happened and been done. They plan on dropping an alpha for this title a little bit later, but it's very ambitious, I would say. It's aiming to have a fully systemic world on this island. I believe it's called West. A pretty intricate damage system, similar to what you've seen in games like Kenshi as an example. So it'll be interesting to see it all come together, but this is a game I will cover a little more in depth when the alpha drops, as I should get access to it via Kickstarter if nothing else. And if they can actually deliver on some of their stated goals of what they plan to do with some of the world interactivity and how a lot of that stuff works, then I think this will be one to watch, even if the name is a little silly. Now, I'm always kind of on the fence about whether or not to consider this next one a true CRPG, but, it always kind of gets lumped in anyway, so here we are, and that is the Gothic Remake. Very much so looking forward to this title. It did recently get an official release date of June 5th, so not too much longer to go there. As a full-blown remake, it's definitely going to be some people's first introduction to the Gothic series as a whole, and my own wasn't that long ago myself, so I'm genuinely really excited to see how people react to this remake, because I really enjoyed the original when I played it just a few years ago, even though that version is quite dated and not exactly new player friendly, and I'm hoping they can deliver on some of that core premise with this remake, but we'll see what happens. Last but not least for the upcoming titles is Zero Parades for Dead Spies. Now I'm throwing this one in here more as a morbid curiosity, As I am fully aware, this is very much like dead in the water for a lot of people given the studio behind its history with Disco Elysium and the back and forth with the people that worked there, etc. I'll be completely real with you, I just cannot keep up with the full story and all the different angles on it, but they recently put out a demo for Zero Parades, which I went ahead and took a look at, again, out of curiosity, if anything else, and while it's doing some interesting stuff that I think advances some of what Disco Elysium was trying to do, that demo also makes a ton of parallels to that game in a way that's probably not going to make for a flattering comparison. But for me at least, I just kind of want to know how it pans out after all the drama and everything with the studio and stuff, and so I'm looking forward to it in that sense. Now, there are a couple more games I want to mention, but these are titles that, technically speaking, are already out in some capacity. Obligatory mention for Swordhaven. I've been keeping an eye on Swordhaven since it released back in December, because it released in a very odd way where the 1.1 update seems like more of what should have been its actual launch. Looking forward to playing that when it finishes up. I also wanted to give a small update on New Arc Line. So back in, I believe it was December, I put out a video mentioning that it looked like New Arc Line is having some development troubles for sure, which remains the case. At the time, the publisher reached out to explain that, they were still working on the game and they had some updates in the pipeline and everything. But it's been about 3.5 months since then, and the most we've gotten are dev diaries, so I expect the troubles there to continue, but, given the situation around the development team, who is based out of Ukraine, that's not by any means a big surprise. But I did just want to throw this out there so people are aware in case you had any questions about it, I guess. Then we've got the Pillars 1 turn-based update. This is actually still in public beta. Just wanted to mention that. When the turn-based mode drops into like a full regular release for Pillars 1, I will probably jump into it and take a look at the finished version and use that simply as an excuse to play that game a little bit more. And then there is Solasta 2. Solasta 2 very recently launched into early access on March 12th. So it is available for people to play. The initial look at it seems to be pretty promising. They definitely have some work to do in some places to fix things up, respond to feedback, but the early feedback is pretty positive, and I'm hoping that Solasta 2 is able to make really productive use of its early access period to make that game the best it can be. But it's already a giant jump in quality and production value, which hits you pretty much straight away if you've played the original. And then last but not least, before we close this one out, coming up in roughly a month or two, I would say, for the first one, and then a couple more months after that for the second one, Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader is in fact getting some DLC, which will add even more content to that game, and we'll see after that stuff is released whether or not it's meant to be like the final round of DLC, and then I'll start updating all of my old content for it just to make sure it's up to date. So we've still got some stuff to go on that front as well, but for right now, I think that's a pretty good look at everything on the horizon and stuff currently ongoing in the world of CRPGs. But, by all means, if I missed something you want to talk about, feel free to drop it down in the comments section below, which is as convenient a time as any to say. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.